Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 25 of Opening Basics. In this video we're going to continue our look at the Scotch game, so let's put that on the board. E4, E5, putting pawns in the center, knight to F3 attacking the E-pawn, knight to C6 defending, and now D4 attacking it again. So in the last video, black takes. And then in the last video we looked at Gambit lines like bishop C4 and pawn to C3, bishop C4 the Scotch Gambit and pawn to C3 the Goering Gambit. Now I mentioned in talking about the Scotch Gambit, let's go ahead and put this on the board, that it had the advantage over the Goering Gambit that it's not so easy for black to decline. He can't immediately play D5, for example, like he does in the Goering. But there is a way for black to decline the Scotch Gambit, so I just wanted to mention that. It's not so great, but it is, if you really don't want to play a gambit, you don't want to give your opponent that gambit initiative, you can refuse the gambit. You start by playing bishop c5, defending the pawn, and after castling, instead of playing knight to f6, bring the knight to e7 here, so that so white isn't tempted to play this e5 move so much. And you just wait in general until white plays the move c3. And then the idea of refusing the gambit is to not let white take back, but to push this pawn forward. And then white doesn't get the big center. If you just leave the pawn there and let white recapture, white builds up a big center, and that's pretty good for white. But you can push that pawn forward, force white to recapture with a piece, and now there's no particular center advantage for one side or the other. You can castle and play d6 and get a position that's playable, but white has a fair edge here, so it's probably not the best way to play. I think the best way for black to play is to accept the gambit and play some of the lines I discussed in the previous video. But I just wanted to clarify that it's not that you can't refuse. It's not that you can't refuse the gambit. There are ways to decline the gambit, but they leave white in a pretty good position. Okay, so let's back up. So here we are after pawn takes on d4. It's white's turn to move, and the normal move, the main line of the Scotch, is just to take with the knight and just play this position. And there's two main responses. There's bishop to c5 and there's knight to f6, and I will talk about those. I think bishop c5 I will save for the next video, so this video I will talk about knight f6. There's also bishop to b4. I'll include that when I talk about bishop c5. So we'll leave those bishop moves for a later video, and this one will mostly talk about the knight f6 move, which is a very classical way of playing. But there is one kind of crazy and offbeat way for black to play, which is queen h4. So let's talk about this one first. I like these obscure sidelines. And what's funny about this one is that this actually wins a pawn for black. So it's maybe not obvious, but this pawn is under attack and it's hard to defend. Now there is a move here that completely ignores the threat, and that is the move knight b5. And this is kind of a wild and crazy way to play, but you're just counterattacking. You're letting black take there with check, and you're counterattacking on c7, threatening to fork the king and the rook. And I'm not going to talk any more about this line because it's too complicated, and so I'm going to give white a simpler way of playing. But if you're into some really crazy stuff, you might want to do some research on that one and see if you can play it. No, the best way for white to play is first to defend the pawn. But keep this knight b5 idea in mind, because that comes up later, even in this line. And so you think, well, what's the problem here? He attacked the pawn, you've defended it. Well, he can pin that knight, and now you're left with no piece that can defend in any reasonable way. So, say bishop here gives up the knight, so you can't play that. Queen to defend. Well, if you play the queen here, then once again that gives up the knight. And if you try queen to d3, this is playable, but knight f6 is a good move for black. Actually, black has the advantage. So maybe I exaggerated when I said it wins a pawn by force, but it leaves black with a good position if you don't let him take the pawn. So actually, the best move for white in this position after you play this sort of natural defending move, let him pin the knight, and then you just give up on that pawn and play bishop to e2. So this has two ideas. Bishop to e2 is just developing a piece and preparing to castle, so that's one move, one idea. But the other idea is now when the queen takes on e4, it's not with check. So queen takes e4, and then now you play knight b5. So you get this threat on c7, but at a time when you're prepared to castle, and so you don't suffer this terrible counterattack. Notice that if if black tries to grab on g2 at this point, you have bishop to f3, chasing the queen around, and then you can grab on c7. So that's good for black. So how does black react to this threat? In fact, the only way, notice that there's no piece that can easily defend this pawn. I guess the bishop could come back. Knight takes d6 check, c takes d6, and knight takes e4. Oh yeah, the queen the queen is under threat there. See, the bishop can't come back. Sorry. So you take off here to get rid of the threat to the queen, and now there's no piece that can defend here except the queen. And if the queen goes there to defend, you kick it with f4, and it can't defend the pawn. So the only move for black to stay in the game is actually king d8, and then white can castle here. And so this is the position I will leave you in. The position stands, white is down a pawn, and he also has these doubled pawns that are weak on the queen side. But he has easy development for all his pieces. He has the bishop pair. His rooks have good files to operate on. The bishop can come out along either diagonal, and he's got this threat on c7. Although it's important not to focus too much on that threat to c7. If black defends that, the knight can regroup into the center, and it's just an excellent position for white, even though he's down a pawn. The engine evaluation, it's not just saying that white has compensation for the pawn. It says that white has a strong advantage here. So this is a good position for white, and one you shouldn't be afraid of playing. So that's my recommended approach for dealing with queen h4. So let's run through that again. So pawn takes, knight takes. We're just in the main line. You're expecting knight f6 or bishop c5, and instead black plays queen h5 here. So you just defend, and as long as you can defend that pawn normally with just normal developing moves. The queen, by the way, is pinning the f-pawn, so you have no defense with the f-pawn. As long as you can defend that pawn with normal developing moves, you should. And then at this point, when there's no reasonable way to defend the pawn, you give up on the pawn, but you play bishop e2 to prevent the check and allow castling. And then you play knight b5 to go after c7. And those are the main ideas. And the main line from here continues with the bishop takes. And that's what I showed. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and king to d8. And then you play this position. Your opponent has lost his castling privileges. You go for piece activity. You castle and get all your pieces in the game quickly. And you should be able to overwhelm black's pieces because of his lack of development. Also, notice that you shouldn't be afraid of trading. Say he goes knight f6, bishop here. If you trade off your opponent's active pieces for your active pieces, you're going to be left with your pieces that are still active, and he's going to be left with his pieces which are trapped behind his king. So you shouldn't avoid trades at all costs. I mean, in general, you want to keep the material on and keep it complicated so you can get all your pieces out. You have ideas like rook e1, chasing his queen, and stuff like that. But just keep in mind you shouldn't avoid trades at all costs. Okay, that's enough for this funny line. Let's talk about the main line here, or one of the main lines. So it was d4, pawn takes, knight takes, and two main moves are bishop c5 or knight f6. So we're going to spend the rest of this video on the knight f6 line. And this is what, when Kasparov reintroduced the Scotch game at top level play, this is how Karpov responded with the knight f6 line. And this is a very respectable and long-standing continuation, just attacking that pawn and asking white what he wants to do about it. He can't move it forward because because the knight will just take it. So white starts by trading, taking off this knight, and black wants to take back with the b pawn. If he takes with the d pawn, you'll trade queens. White will trade queens and disrupt black's castling privilege, and that leaves white with some edge. So this is the best play for black, is to take with the b pawn. And now at this point the pawn could be defended with a move like bishop d3, but that's nothing much for white. The way for white to try for an advantage is to push on with e5. And now a very important move for black is not to move the knight right away, but to throw in this move queen e7. Now, moving the knight, it's a playable move, but well, white just has a good game. What you do with black here in this opening is you try and discoordinate white's pieces a little bit with these pins and things. So you pin this pawn so the knight can't be taken, and you attack it. This pawn is under attack. So the move queen e2 is pretty much the only move here. It defends the pawn, renews the threat on the knight, and now the knight moves. But black has accomplished a little bit of something by throwing in that queen move, which is he's got white's queen onto the e2 square, blocking the normal development of the bishop. And also it's a target there. We'll see after the move c5 to chase the knight again, which is the main move. Black has the move bishop to a6 available, pinning that pawn and saving the knight once more. I should say right here there's two moves. And in the games between Kasparov and Karpov, it was played twice in the 1990 World Championship. In one game, Karpov played knight b6, and in the other game he played bishop a6. And Kasparov had a decent score in those games. He drew one game and he won the other. So he did okay with this opening, so it sort of helped reestablish the Scotch game as an opening that could be played at the top level. I think the line with knight b6 was a game where Karpov drew, and the line with bishop a6 was the line that Kasparov managed to win. The chess engine shows both of them as pretty comparable. I think it has a slight preference to this bishop a6 move, so maybe that's the most accurate way to play. And then white usually responds with b3. It shores up this pawn and frees the queen to move without having to defend that c pawn forever. And now, black can continue in different ways. There's actually even the move castle queenside, although it's hard to recommend that move. I think g6 is the most solid way for black to play, just preparing to develop this bishop out here. And white can respond in kind with g3, but more normal is to play f4, trying to shore up the center. So basically what white is doing is he's gaining space, and he's trying to relieve his queen of its duties. It was busy babysitting two different pawns there, and then white will continue development from here. Let's see, and black can immediately go after this center with pawn to f6. So I think I'm going to leave this variation here at this point. The theory goes on for quite a while. The chess engine rates this position as pretty even, only a slight edge to white. And there's a number of different responses that black has at this point. There's queen b4 check, which is met by bishop to e2. There's f6, which can be met by the move bishop to a3. Keep in mind you've got a knight here supporting the bishop on this diagonal, maybe putting some pressure on the queen. And then there's bishop to g7, maybe the most logical move. And after bishop g7, let's see, queen f2 is the main move. So stepping out of these pins and threatening the knight, and play continues from here, like I said, with some slight edge to white. Kind of an interesting position because we've gone fairly deep in the opening, and white still has a lot of development to finish, but he does have a lot of pawns out. So a complicated, unbalanced position, and kind of interesting. So that is the bishop to a6 line. The other line here is knight to b6, and knight also attacks the c pawn, so you could consider a move like b3 here. The main move, though, actually is to develop the knight. There's two moves: knight to d3 knight to c3 or knight to d2. I think, to my taste, knight to c3 looks a little more appealing, although knight d2 has the advantage that it's defending the pawn. If you play knight d2, excuse me, that'll be part of a strategy where you play b3 and bishop to b2, and the bishop on b2 will help support this pawn. So that's a reasonable way to play. And if you go knight to c3, which is slightly more popular, queen to e6 is a move, getting out of the way of the bishop. It's the main move. And then queen to e4. Maybe not the first move you'd think of, but it has the same idea. First of all, you need to continue defending this pawn. Second of all, you get out of the way of the bishop. Queen e6 was attacking that c pawn too. So that's a way to maintain the defense of the c pawn and at the same time get out of the way of the bishop. Black can continue piling up the pressure with bishop a6 now, and now you play b3. So this b3 move gets played sooner or later, and once again, Black can castle queenside here, or he can develop the bishop. Bishop to b4 is the top choice here. Let's see, bishop b4. So the advantage of bishop b4 is it encourages this bishop to go to d2 instead of going to the b2 square, where it would be pretty good. And I'm going to leave this variation off here. This is slightly less crazy. So, it seems like White is in a position where he's about to castle. Black can actually castle on either side. I mean, it does look funny to castle into this side of the board where the pawn structure is so messed up. But if you look at all Black's pieces, they're all over here on the queen side, so it's pretty safe. So I can see castling queen side for Black in a position like this. Although the book move here is the exchange first. Let's see, I'll put on a few more moves. Bishop takes, and d5, trying to counterattack in the center. Yeah, I guess castling is not yet safe. d5. And what's wrong with castling? Let's back up just a second. If you castle, does White have some big threat here? Bishop to d3. Yeah, that's a bit risky. So White does have quick attacking ideas. And if you castle queenside, bishop to e2 or f3. I don't know. The chess engine is giving a strong advantage for White here. And in fact says the only move for Black is d5. So a bit of a tricky position for Black, maybe. Trying to remember to play actively and keep going after these pawns here. I guess that's the key from Black's point of view. Okay, like I said, this is deeper than I usually go in these opening basics, but there's some interesting lines. So let's just back up and talk about the knight f6 move a little. So the idea after takes, knight f6, is for White to exchange the knight first. This knight is under a bit of trouble, unless he wants to transpose into the 4-knight Scotch. Take the knight first, take back with the b pawn, then push the e pawn forward. And now it's Black has to remember these tactical moves. Bishop here, queen here, bishop here, and interesting play ensues, and White makes lots of pawn moves. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I am going to follow up in the next video with the bishop moves. We'll take a look after the knight move. Instead of knight f6, we're going to take a look at the bishop moves, bishop to c4 and bishop to b5. And those are, bishop c4 is probably the main line at this point. It has the most moves in the database. The knight f6 line is the second most popular line. Okay, see you guys then. Bye.